at 560theanswer.com. Now, from the Signature Bank Studios. Only the biggest stories, only the biggest guests, and only the biggest opinions. This is AM 560, The Answer.
AM 560, The Answer, Chicago's Morning Answer. Chris Crocken for Dan Proft. Dan's back after the holidays. So, this is a great time to talk to John Hinderaker, president of the Center of the American Experiment and contributor to Powerline. John, welcome to AM 560, The Answer.
Well, hi, Chris. Great to be with you.
Great to be with you, too. I got to tell you, this is so crazy, obviously. Everything we've seen with the fraud in Minnesota, the land of 10,000 frauds, I guess somebody was calling it. Tell me the depth of the fraud that you've been able to cover and see. We have the assistant U.S. attorney for Minnesota saying that $9 billion just in Medicaid fraud alone. But you also have these daycare centers that journalist Nick Shirley blew up. And by the way, I used to work at KSTP Radio in the early 2000s, and in the building there is KSTP TV. I just saw that 11 months ago you had an in-depth piece about the fraud at the daycare centers with Jay Kulisk, I think is his name, at KSTP. So tell me the depth of the fraud with Medicaid, with these daycare facilities, what your reaction is to the Nick Shirley stuff just absolutely blowing up over the weekend into today. And then what are the other fraud stuff that you've seen that we have going on there in Minnesota? Talk to me.
Well, this has been going on for a long time, and it's been centered in the Somali community. You can go back a decade, and there was child care fraud. You know, the people would set up a supposed child care, and they'd manufacture a list of mostly or entirely fictitious children and say, oh, yeah, I'm caring for all these children, put in for money to the state of Minnesota, and they'd get paid. People went to jail for that 10 years ago. So this story has been a long time in the making. The frauds extend across the entire range of Minnesota state government programs, although the dollars involved, it's important to know, are largely federal dollars. So the famous fraud is called Feeding Our Future, and that was in a program that was intended to feed lunches, breakfasts to poor children. And that's the fraud that has really been criminally prosecuted over the last couple of years. I think 86 people have been charged, 55 or 60 have either been convicted in a couple of jury trials or have pled guilty. And that fraud was actually administered by the Minnesota Department of Education, and it amounted to something like $500 million. The big group of frauds, and this is, you mentioned the Assistant U.S. Attorney, Joe Thompson, has said that their investigation, the federal investigation, suggests that at least half of all of the Medicaid dollars spent in Minnesota were fraudulent. That's where the $9 billion comes from, because that total is $18 billion, half would be $9 billion. He says at least half are fraudulent. And then you've got daycare centers. That's a whole other category.
Yes.
It's not under Medicaid. It's not part of the Feeding Our Future scandal. So this is back where we started 10 years ago, daycare fraud. And again, what these people do, they'll set up a supposed daycare. They'll put into the state government and say, oh, I'm caring for 90 children, and what Nick Shirley, little 23-year-old YouTuber, did is he got official government records, of where these child care centers are, what they're called, who runs them, how many children they supposedly are caring for. And he and a friend, a colleague, started just driving around to these places and knocking on the door, and nowhere did they find any children. I mean, none. And they were treated like interlopers and threatened, if they didn't get off the premises. And this guy, Nick Shirley, would say, well, I'm looking for a child care to enroll my son in.
Mm-hmm.
And these people obviously were not looking for customers, right? And so, what's the total amount of the frauds? I don't know. I would say it's clearly more than $10 billion over the last few years.
John, how many of we've heard and we've seen that the folks with the state employees that have been seeing this fraud have whistleblowers and such, and they're maintaining, we have warned you, Governor Walz. We've told you about this. You've attacked us. You have through your proxies, and you've threatened us, etc. How real is that? How much truth is there to that? That state employees were absolutely blowing the whistle, including, I guess, union members representing these employees. Were they doing that, and to what extent?
It's a little bit unclear, Chris. There's a Facebook group that purports to have about 100 members who are employees or maybe former employees of the Department of Human Services here in Minnesota. And that's where these claims have been made about them trying to blow the whistle, telling their superiors, look, there's massive fraud going on. That group is anonymous. I don't think any of the individuals have stepped forward, at least not to my knowledge. I know that some legislators have told me personally that they've talked with some of those people. And so it's a little unclear to what extent people inside the Walz administration have been trying to blow the whistle on these frauds. We know that some people in the Somali community years ago were trying to draw attention to the Feeding Our Future fraud, and that is ultimately what got the FBI involved and what stimulated the federal prosecutions. And so there's been a lot of information about this bubbling under the surface. I mean, my organization and my website both have been writing about the fraud starting in January of 2022, so it'll be 4 years next month. So there's been a lot of information out there. And what is true is that our state government, under Tim Walz and our Attorney General Keith Ellison, has played no part in trying to stop these frauds or cracking down on the frauds or prosecuting the frauds. On the contrary, just days before the first FBI raids, a group of Feeding Our Future fraudsters met with the Attorney General, Keith Ellison, to complain that the Department of Education was threatening to cut off funding. Mm-hmm. And they said they're being harassed, because these are all racists in the administration. Mm-hmm. And Keith Ellison undertook to help them and said he would make some phone calls, look into it. And he said that Governor Walz agreed with him that these stupid, piddly things shouldn't stand in the way of these East African businesses. The stupid, piddly things are the multi-billion-dollar frauds. So the most charitable thing you can say about Tim Walz and his administration is that it has been completely asleep at the switch for years.
There's another thing, John. The Kelly Loeffler, the head of the Small Business Administration, cutting off millions of dollars of loans, alleging fraud through PPP and other Small Business Administration loans. What do you know about that? Because that's another wrinkle in this whole thing, right? And what do you know about that and the extent of the fraud there?
Well, I guess what I know about is what you just said. Kelly Loeffler has cut off some small business funding, and like I said before, these frauds seem to extend through virtually every program administered by the state of Minnesota. So I guess it would be surprising if there were not fraud in those programs, but it's not something that really has been reported on or that I know much about. I'll tell you, the real hammer would be if the federal government cut off Minnesota's Medicaid funding.
How likely do you think that is with this amount of fraud? Half of every dollar.
I mean, that would be a huge measure. They're talking about cutting off education funding because Minnesota is going to the wall, on boys and girls sports and boys and girls showers and so forth. And so that battle's going on right now. Cutting off Medicaid funding would be a very, very big deal. That would be a very severe sanction. And yet you have to wonder with the volume. I mean, if 50% of all the dollars spent in Minnesota are criminal fraud, well, they should cut off the funding.
Yeah, I mean, because you can't say, well, we want to help people, even if half of it is given to fraudsters, we still want to keep pouring money into this. I mean, it's unreal. John Hinderaker, president of Center for American Experiment and contributor to Powerline. More questions for you here. How about this? Your Minnesota Lieutenant Governor, Peggy Flanagan, who previously wore a shirt with a knife on it that said "Protect Trans Kids," featuring that knife as a threat. I believe that was over a press conference where she and Governor Walz, the Minnesota legislature, made it so that transgender butchery for minors, tourism like that, coming in, doing that would be okay. Parents wouldn't be allowed to know about it, or didn't have to be notified, and didn't have to cooperate with investigations from out of state, etc. Is that what that was about? And then, second of all, what's your reaction to her then showing up with a hijab on and saying, Assalamu alaikum? Here's the first few seconds of that, actually. I'll play that right here. Wait, hold on. There's another one. It's this one. Here you go.
Assalamu alaikum. My name's Peggy Flanagan. I am the Lieutenant Governor of Minnesota, and I'm really honored and humbled to be here with all of you today. I am incredibly clear that the Somali community is part of the fabric of the state of Minnesota.
How crazy that this crazy leftist would stand there and put a hijab on, cover herself up to pander to the Somali community. What's your reaction to all that she's been doing with that and this embarrassing, humiliating television appearance? Yeah,
it was embarrassing. Around the country, there's a lot of memes popping up where this picture of Flanagan in a hijab is being compared to The Handmaid's Tale.
Yes,
it actually looks a lot like. She is a crazy left winger, an absolutely crazy left winger, but she's also the current front runner for our open Senate seat here in Minnesota up in 2026. And what you just played there and what Peggy Flanagan has been saying and doing is the approach of the Walz administration. They are simply trying to brazen this out. They are 100% behind the Somalis, apparently including the fraudsters. They constantly try to minimize the extent of the fraud and cast aspersions on the people who have exposed the fraud, including the assistant U.S. attorney, who has successfully prosecuted these cases. And again, they are. They're just standing four square behind these practices that have made Minnesota the easiest place in the country to defraud. One of the things we've seen is what the U.S. Attorney called fraud tourism. Criminals from around the country. A couple guys from Philadelphia have gotten word. All you got to do is come to Minnesota and send the state government an invoice, and they'll pay it. It's easy pickings. So we've had people actually moving here to commit fraud because word is out on the criminal community that it's so easy. And but the reaction of the Walz administration has been what you just played. These are our neighbors. We're behind them 100%. There's not much to see here. Everybody move along.
Okay, so you have 100,000 roughly a voter block of Somali folks that are voting, and apparently they can make or break somebody if you're running for office, statewide office in Minnesota. Is that accurate?
Well, it depends where you are. I mean, if you're in the city of Minneapolis, they absolutely can make you or break you, which is why Jacob Fry, the incumbent mayor of Minneapolis, had to learn to speak Somali and try to do Somali dances. I mean, the video footage of him is just, to talk about embarrassing. I mean, it's just unreal. But it's a voting bloc that clearly sways the city of Minneapolis. It sways Hennepin County, which is the county that Minneapolis is in. And it has swung some statewide elections. It is a very solid voting bloc for the DFL party, which I think is why we see all this money being scattered around. And it's a very important force in state politics.
What about the denaturalization and possible deportation of Somali folk in Minneapolis, St. Paul, who are found with fraud, and where do you think that's going ultimately, about the percentage of people that are Somalis that are in your area there in Minneapolis, St. Paul, that could be denaturalized and deported due to fraud?
Well, it's a very small number. The thing for our listeners to understand is that this is not primarily a story about illegal immigration. Mm-hmm. This is really a story about legal immigration. Mm-hmm. And these Somalis and the DFL party have been very assiduous about becoming citizens. And that's why they're able to vote in substantial numbers. Now, theoretically, if you look at the immigration laws, a handful of them could be denaturalized and deported. Certainly the ones that are convicted of fraud or plead guilty to fraud are in that category. The problem with that remedy is that you got to do it one at a time. You can't denaturalize a big group of people. And so realistically, it's just not something that is going to make a big impact on the numbers. Although I think it would be good if they denaturalized and deported even a handful of these folks.
Yes. As
a warning, even as a symbolic response.
Speaking of that, what about Ilhan Omar with the reported marriage fraud? Marrying her brother, reportedly, and with that immigration fraud, possibly. What do you think the possibilities of her getting? Tom Holman said that they're investigating it. What do you think the chances are that they find that she did marry her brother and therefore committed immigration fraud and is deportable?
Well, so she immigrated to the U.S. At age 12, and it was some years after that when she pretended to marry her brother. It was a legal ceremony. She was already married to someone else, several children by him. There was some fraudulent purpose behind marrying her brother. It's never been entirely clear what that fraudulent purpose was. It may have simply had to do with being eligible to cohabitate as students at North Dakota State University. So there's no question she did marry her brother, and it was a fraud. That is absolutely clear. I think the likelihood of the federal government trying to denaturalize her over that or anything else is extremely slight. And frankly, I don't think politically it would be a good idea. I think it would generate tremendous blowback, and I don't think would be very productive.
Okay, now you wrote a great column about all this fraud, about Walz. What are his chances of getting reelected for an unprecedented, if I'm not mistaken, or at least very hard to win in Minnesota politics, third term as a governor of the state of Minnesota? And you put numbers down and predicted the chances of Walz, getting reelected and stuff. I have this weird feeling, and you'll know Minnesota politics more than I ever will, since I was only there for 2 years doing a talk show back in the day. But what are his chances? My feeling, again, being an outsider, is that he's going to have to pull out of the race because this has blown up over the weekend even insanely more. Or if I'm not mistaken, that's where I sit from. So I don't see how he's going to make it through. But you tell me.
Well, we'll see. So some people think that the national Democrats would like to force him out of the race like they did Joe Biden. And by the way, we've never had a three-term governor in Minnesota. This would be unprecedented.
Yeah.
And there's some evidence for that. There was an article in the New York Times, also a couple of op-eds in the Washington Post on the fraud story within the last few weeks that were very critical of Tim Walz. So why would they do that? A lot of people think that's a sign that the National Party wants him out. That said, it's easier said than done, and if he's determined to stay the course, there's no clear path to forcing him out. What they could do is threaten to cut off funding, and the Minnesota Democrats get most of their money from outside of Minnesota. The number one donor to politics in Minnesota is your governor, J.B. Pritzker.
Yep.
And so what I said in my post is I think there's a 40% chance that Walz either looks at the polling and thinks it's hopeless, which so far you're not really seeing in the polling, or that the National Democrats succeed in forcing him out. So I think a 60% chance that he actually is the DFL nominee. But if he runs, I think if the Republicans nominate one of their strong candidates, they can beat him. I think there's a 60% chance that if he's in the race and the Republicans nominate somebody good, the Republican will win. First time Republicans will have won a statewide race in Minnesota since 2006, by the way. So they're on a real losing streak.
John Hinderaker.
The problem, of course, is Minnesota Republicans do not have a great track record when it comes to nominating their best candidates. So put that together, and I figure there's roughly one chance in four of Tim Walz getting a third term.
Interesting. John Hinderaker, thank you very much for your time. President of the Center of the American Experiment and contributor to Powerline. Appreciate you very much coming on today.
Great to be with you, Chris.
Thank you. All right, coming up next on Chicago's Morning Answer, the Kane County State's Attorney is checking out whether to prosecute ICE. And boy,